Chelsea. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
How you doing in this moment?
I'm okay. You know, there is a lot going on right now. Generally, where I currently am. So generally okay.
Yeah, feels like those are the days. I haven't had anyone say, I'm great, right, ready to go in these particular times in March of 2025. But we are speaking with Chelsea Peterson-Salahuddin, assistant professor at the University of Michigan today about social media and technology. And I'm super excited to speak with you because I know you've written a lot about this and continue to research the many ways that we can maybe do better with social media and technology. Um, Before we get into all the nitty gritty, I wanted to start and ask you, for those listening who might not be familiar with your work, can you tell me how you developed your interest in media technology and culture?
Yeah. I don't know if there was one clear path to developing my interest. I think that when I was an undergraduate, I was trying to explore areas that I was not as familiar with. And I ended up taking a media studies class. And I really enjoyed this unit that we did thinking about like ethnography and anthropology in media and thinking about the ways that we use media to talk about, to think about, to translate culture. So I think that was one seed. Um, After graduating, I also got a job in journalism. And I think it kind of unveiled for me like what the day to day is of creating media, specifically informational media, journalism, the role that social media often plays in that nowadays. And I think all of those interests kind of coalesced. So when I originally went to grad school, I was really interested in asking questions around like the production of journalism and like information media, in large part because I never actually studied that. I went to a school that was very big on liberal arts. So we were not allowed to have any vocational majors. So I was not allowed to study like journalism as a practice or any kind of like communications that can be practiced. It was all very media theory. And I was really interested in like, what does this actually look like when people are like making things and engaging in things? Um, and then as I thought about that more, I think again, that interest in thinking about how not just kind of mainstream media that I'd been working with, but people who had different orientations towards media and cultural practices in media. What did it look like to produce things in different ways that I had seen before? And so I think that's where that interest came from for me. And I've just kind of like grown and expanded it over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not too uncommon to have an experience in media and then be studying media. But I do think that the particular moment that you emerged in like broadcast journalism was like really unique in terms of it was kind of the waning days of the power of the TV and the emergence of the new media. And you were kind of bridging that, right? Like you were working like in the new media kind of section.
Well, I mean, I had this. Well, I was working at a news media outlet that was like very, at the time, very focused on doing like hard news. What I did for a small bit was there was a recognition that like people enjoy watching like the virality of things that happen online. And sometimes that can be like more fluff, like puppy dogs and, like funny pictures. But sometimes it like the things that people take out their phone and record every day are actually important things for people to know about, right? Like the power of, you know, kind of community sourced media or things that people are uploading online to YouTube and things like live leaks. And so, yeah, it was my job for a while in the middle of the night to like scour the internet and find, things that people posted online, but also things that people maybe should know about and should get more exposure. And think about like how we are going to very like maybe quickly talk about those things in between talking about kind of larger national and international politics. Um, but yeah, I think being at a very large broadcast network, there was this sense that I mean, inside of it, it didn't feel like it was waning. Like it felt like the people there really felt like this was the space that everyone is turning to get their news and information. Whether or not that was actually true, but I think that's like what it felt like. But also at the same time, like a lot of places where we were looking for stories was not just the AP. It was like, tweet decks and like using things like data miner to, find tweets, to find Instagram posts. So the kind of really prevalent role of social media in even like mainstream news editorial decisions was very, very prevalent in that moment, I think. And I think we all understood that there is a symbiosis happening here.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, remembering this is probably in the 20 teens ish. So social media was growing up at that point. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious for you, do you have a social media origin story, a moment when you first realized the power of these allegedly connective technologies? What is your relationship to social media
Um, it's
historically?
interesting. I always joke that like as somebody who studies a lot of social media, I'm not good at social media. Like I feel like I am really interested in the ways that people like connect and move across social media, but like as an individual person, I feel like I've always had like an odd relationship to it. Like when I was younger, I remember like the like MySpace wave of it all. And like being really afraid to like connect with people online. Maybe in parts I watched a lot of SVU in my home. But and I think as I got older, right? Like for instance, I only ever had like Twitter for school and work purposes, but then after I started using it, I was like, oh, this is like a really interesting place to be. But I'm kind of a lurker too. Like I like to observe interactions. And I don't think if I hadn't, like, I was asked to get it for a media theory project. And then I had to have it when I worked in news because a part of my job was scouring online. And I found myself being like a constant observer of online spaces and like connecting with people in like very quiet ways, if that makes sense, like following, liking, reposting, sharing, uplifting. Um, but I don't know if I have an origin story in the sense of like a very personal moment that happened to me, but I do remember there was this point where I was like continually looking at it and like almost like being an observer of conversations that I was in the sense that I was like agreeing or thinking about, but like wasn't loudly in the same way. And I feel like that has remained my relationship to a lot of social media platforms, and that I think I get joy from, in part, the like observing of the things that people can do that I sometimes don't always know if I have like the capacity or even sometimes the creativity that I feel like to do myself. But getting joy in like seeing other people being able to do that. Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that it is a form of creative labor, right? And you've
Oh.
studied this as well, like posting on social media. And I think most people don't know that for most platforms, it's a tiny percentage of users who actually post with any kind of regularity or have audiences of any substantial size. Um, it's yeah, it's that tiny minority that like constitutes people's view of the platform, which makes me wonder, um, in your work, you've looked at how people use social media. When, for you, has social media or other connective technology helped advance collective action and storytelling? When have you seen the power of this medium to kind of move narratives in a bigger way, even if most people are just lurking?
Um, I think the ways I've seen it happen is that it allows people who maybe don't know each other, who are maybe very disparately connected, but to like snowball a bigger conversation about something that's happening um, in various ways, right? So I think a lot of people have, especially when we're talking about kind of maybe social political connective action, or even thinking about things that are happening in the pop culture zeitgeist and how those connect to kind of larger issues that we're thinking about in our society. You know, one thing that I love seeing happen and I love to think about myself, right, is that we'll have these ideas in our head and we'll have these conversations, but you have just one person say it. And then you look in the comments or you look at the responses or you look at the reposts, right? And it starts to build and it starts to swell. And I think the thing about social media in particular, too, is because often it is thought of as a fun place or a place where you can talk about more trivial things. Those more trivial things turn into these larger conversations. So I wrote a paper recently about people like using like drama as a starting off point to talk about like social and political issues, specifically around like things like race, gender, and sexuality. And I think what was so interesting about that was that when you kind of look at these incidences from the offset, right? That's something you would see in like a tabloid or like an entertainment weekly Instagram post, right? It doesn't seem like there is this deeper, broader conversation, right? But it's things people are thinking and it allows them to really bring it to the forefront in like really tangible ways that are not just educational, but also really entertaining too. And I think there is something too about that entertainment aspect, that not feeling like you have to be formal, that you can be creative in the ways that you talk about things and you think about things. That's really like engaging and I think makes people want to join in the conversation themselves, right? That makes people want to make it into a richer conversation.
Yeah, it kind of used to be, maybe back when I was a kid, you're a little bit younger than me, I think, but like that entertainment was something that professionals out there did, and they spent months crafting the narrative, or they had these huge teams to craft the narrative, and that was what you responded to, maybe with like your family, the people in your life. But now that response itself is a form of entertainment, and people can like gather together and have a whole different form of cultural production just based on what they're observing out there in the world, including in media. Can you give some examples of how you've seen this, maybe with these kinds of intersectional communities that you're talking about? Like, when do you see that collapse of reception and production and the collapse of like politics and entertainment, or information and entertainment online?
Yeah. Actually, I can talk about one that I was watching a lot of videos about this morning, if I will, or earlier today in my 15-minute breaks. But there's a conversation going on right now, and this is on TikTok in particular, which is another space that I really love because, again, I think the creativity that it allows people to engage in, and I can see how much labor people put into like making the things that they produce on there, which I also just generally really appreciate because, again, it's like I don't think I have the capacity, but I love watching it. But in particular, there's a conversation happening right now. And I think to your point, like, so there was an incident surrounding one of the Real Housewives episodes or franchises. Not sure how much you watch Housewives.
I know it's huge. It's not for me, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. I have a couple I watch. I don't watch this particular one. I think that there have been a lot of conversations over the years about kind of the racial makeup of the different franchises that they have, right? And where they choose to have like predominantly Black casts and predominantly white casts, and where they've been now trying to reboot to think about having more kind of multicultural racial diversity. But there is a cast franchise where and has traditionally just been white women. And this was the first season where they had two very well-known Black women on the show.
Garcelle Beauvais.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and one of them left. And in reaction to one of them leaving, there was a separate Watch What Happens Live episode where Bozoma St. James was on the show. And a lot of Black women picked up on what they felt was a lack of solidarity between these two Black women, in the sense that the narrative crafted very carefully, I think, in all of their interviews, and very carefully maybe by the network, was like, we're not trying to pit two Black women against each other. This isn't a token thing. You can have more than one, right? But there was this one moment in this one after interview where I think a lot of other Black women picked up on this sense that maybe that's not exactly what the situation was. And it led to this larger conversation that I don't think you'll hear a lot about, but I feel like I've talked about with my friends, I've talked about with other Black women in my family, about how sometimes when you are in these corporate environments, Black women get pitted against each other. And we like to think that it's always solidarity and we are our biggest supporters, but there are interracial frictions based on race and based on gender that we experience. And these are lots of conversations that I have had personally with friends. These are things like I felt like I've experienced at points. I've had this conversation with my mother a lot, right? But it's not a conversation that I hear often talked about publicly by a lot of Black women, about their own experiences feeling this, about picking up on something. There was that Hulu show, The Other Black Girl, right? Where it was like a horror, right? But that is a thing that like Black women experience. And I feel like it was this moment where they were like, oh, this is happening publicly. And I don't know if other people are picking up on it, but we are picking up on it. Let's talk about it. Like, because we experienced this, right? Like, why did it feel a little weird in her response to how do you feel about her leaving? Why did it feel a little like, oh, maybe even though, publicly, again, we're all supporting each other and we're all, like, we have to, like, talking about these interracial, like, within community things, like, sometimes feel very hard to talk about. And something, somebody could argue so trivial, like The Real Housewives or like a Kiki on Watch What Happens Lives could seem just very innocuous. But I think people are like, no, this is something bigger. And like, this isn't just about these two women, right? Because at the end of the day, we don't really know the relationship between these two women, right? We don't really know what happened between them, but we're sensing something familiar that we are now going to collectively talk about. And whether it's between putting together clips or like, responding to comments, like we're, showing different portions of different whatever it is, like however we're going to put together this, or, recollage this conversation, like let's have it. So that's one example that comes to mind, mainly because I've seen it happening just very recently.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, like you said, people might trivialize that show as just about, oh, these are just rich women and they're just doing it for drama and likes and followers and all that stuff. But there are ways that media can put forward a conversation, but they, as the corporation, are not going to take it to the necessary like extent because they have brand issues and stuff. They're trying to protect their brand. Every woman's trying to protect her brand, but users can be like, actually, no, this is what I think the story actually is, right?
Yeah.
The reframing of the actual narrative. And I think this intraracial conversation is so key because it might seem not political, but a lot of people don't know, especially a lot of white people don't know, that a big impediment to equity, equality, and solidarity amongst all kinds of marginalized people are each other, right? Like, how can you build a Black Lives Matter movement if low key everyone whisper networks are like just throwing shade on each other, right? Or talking about how this person says they're for the culture, but they're not really for the culture. And all of this stuff is usually very hush hush, very behind closed doors, but media allows us to talk about it without like sacrificing our own personal relationships, right? Because that's why people don't talk about it, because it's like there's too much reputational stake if you actually talk about people you know.
Right. You don't want to talk about when it happened to you, or
Right.
like, especially like depending on where you work or who you're working with, right? That's why it's also very like you have these conversations with people that you trust also won't maybe repeat them somewhere else, right? But it's like a proxy through which you can then, and also as you talk about it, you realize how many other people are having these similar feelings and experiences, and you're kind of working through them together.
Yeah. I've heard from several Black women in media the whisper networks of the Black women in media that we all uplift that behind the scenes are not actually for Black women, but they could never say it publicly for fear of risking their careers, but it's
And
out
I've
there.
had and I've had friends say it to me about people they work with or I've experienced, but again, would never repeat that in a public forum, reputational damage, career damage, retaliation, especially I think like the media industry, which are, you don't want to get blackballed, you don't want to not be put up for that job, especially if you're thinking about people who are in, a higher position than you. Because I think something I learned, at least in, this small part of journalistic media that I was in, but everybody knows everybody.
You know,
Everybody at every network knows everybody, especially the higher up you get, the more interconnected everyone is. And so again, these are conversations you have with usually people you trust, right? People you know won't repeat it. And yeah, it just becomes a way to have that broader conversation. Because we know these things are happening, but we need an entry point.
Yeah. So we're talking a little bit about the ways that social media does serve as a bit of a like public square where ideas can be kind of shared and bandied about, and there's this like democratic discourse that's happening. But I think we also, and you've written about the ways that these platforms aren't serving the work of community building as well. So can you talk about some of the challenges that communities face in sharing stories, connecting, building solidarity, what have you, through social media platforms?
I mean, I think there's a couple, but I mean, one is, you know, over moderation, or and being moder and I say over moderation in the sense of like you are being moderated because you're violating a policy that that platform has because they feel like you shouldn't be talking about that thing, not because you're talking about something illegal or it's actually explicit content or it's illegal in some way, but kind of the politics that you're bringing up are not aligning with what they would like people to see. Um, because, when you do not own the platform on which you are speaking, right? Your content is always subject to what that platform wants to do with it, whether they want to push it out, whether they don't want to push it out, whether they want to take it down. And, in some cases, for some people who use this as a space of livelihood, take away your livelihood by shutting down what you're talking about. Um, and then I think the other is the fear of harassment, honestly, the fear of being targeted for the things that you're talking about, for your political stance, for the things that you believe. Kind of this not just surveillance from, whatever platform you're on, but for surveillance from other people who can come into your space and say, I don't like that thing you're talking about. And because of that, I'm going to harass you, or I'm going to dox you, or I'm going to target you in some way. It creates this overwhelming sense of fear, but it also creates disconnection between people, right? It creates a disconnection in movements because people are afraid, right? And I think, I mean, and like rightfully so in some cases, right? Like we're not just talking about like hypothetically somebody calling you a name. We're talking about people facing real life threats to their livelihood, to getting fired, to people sending you stuff at your home, and I think that is, I think both of those things often work in tandem, right? Because um I think when people do not like your political stance, when they do not like the things you're fighting for, right? Disconnection, breaking down community, and breaking down like chances for connection coalition are some of the biggest strategies to stopping people.
Yeah, I think about that connection between moderation and surveillance and safety, and how the disproportionate moderation that seems to be happening. There have been studies that show that like marginalized people are over moderated and over policed on platforms, which means the people who have a dominant position in society and are causing disproportionate harm are being under moderated, which means that they get to stay on platform to harass and surveil, dox, etc. And so there's like a general lack of care by platforms of communities that causes all of this damage downstream. There's an example I use in my lectures of a writer that I know who commented on somebody's post, "Men are awful." That's it, just "men are awful," which, is not always true. I mean, like, do I disagree with that statement? Not as a general rule, but is it 100% accurate? No. But is it hate speech? No. Right. But it was labeled hate speech and it was removed, right? And her account was policed for what's an opinion, and also just like a casual comment that's not really harming anybody, actually. Like, I think as a man, I can say men can take it, like,
And
uh,
we'll be fine.
we'll be fine, right? But that idea that that such a simple statement can be policed, when we know from research that women are actually being harassed, doxxed, because they are women, and those men are not getting policed or taken off platform, right? Like, how can you build solidarity and community in that kind of context?
Right, because a lot of it, and a lot of these platforms, it's really because they take this like, first of all, it's profit driven. But when we're thinking about, especially when thinking about protecting different classes of people and marginalized people, they take this equity over equality over equity approach, sorry, a lot of the time, right? So, that was the thing that came out years ago and I think they have maybe technically changed this now, or so they say, but for a while at Facebook, how like saying white man, you would get like removed if you said something negative, as opposed to like a woman or a black child, right? Because it was just like all categories are equally protected, so if we compound two of them, white and man, oh no, even though we know like socially, right, like women and children are more vulnerable in our society, particularly Black children or brown children. And in part, it's because that's what's more advantageous for them, right? In terms of like, not facing pushback from people, in terms of, not coming under any scrutiny. It's easier to just say, okay, well, we're going to pretend like we live in a world where everyone is treated the same, has the same access to opportunities, and faces the same sorts of privilege and oppression. We're just going to move from there, where that's very much not the case. And these, platforms don't operate in a vacuum. They are a product of the societies that we live in. And the societies that we live in need to be dictating how we are, governing these spaces. We can't pretend there's some like separate utopia where none of those outside problems, exist or impact how people are connecting and communicating and existing in these spaces. Like, oh, it's just that has nothing to do with this.
Yeah, there's an ethics and a politics to holding space. Whether that's digital space or physical space, anyone who's hosted a gathering knows that you have to be super attentive to who's in the room, what are the dynamics of power in that room, whether it's like some people are bosses of other people, or some people may have harmed people in that space, right? And it's you're accountable for all of the interactions that happen in that space. And there is this kind of I think it's like the word in Latin would be like terra nullius, of like no man's land, that social media platforms tried to be, where it's like, whose space is this? Like, I don't know. And that is like the way that they kind of offload responsibility and accountability for like the power dynamics they're in.
Yeah.
So I think the question becomes, how can we develop practices, protocols, even new platforms, right, that don't have these problems, that motivate people and encourage people to be vulnerable, honest, connective, in this media landscape?
I think I think you need to start with a platform and a space and whoever's running it, where like the top priority is the care for the people who are on it. I think that oftentimes the top priority is like market shares and like, profit. And if that is your main priority, then that is going to dictate how you build your space and how you make your policy and your governance decisions. And often that is very antithetical to caring about people in capitalism. Um, so I think you make the space by, I think it starts with like intent, right? Like you really need to be intentional and you need to have people who like where care for people is the forefront of what they're doing. And then like constant feedback and communication with different communities that are being served in your space or your platform, right? Not every community group of people is going to need the same things, to feel safe, to feel vulnerable, to feel like they want to feel involved, right? And that can be a lot of work. And you also can't ignore, the fact that there are larger social problems that are going to impact the space and the area that you're in. I remember seeing a speaker for a large like Silicon Valley, tech company, giving a talk, and somebody asked them a question like this in terms of like the potential harms that it could have to, like racially marginalized communities or women. And there was kind of like this like hand waving, like, doesn't matter. Like, it'll be fine, like, and I feel like there was a lack of intentional thought as to like, well, what if it's not? Right? Like think about like what is the harm this could do? Because I think any space, any technology has the potential for help and it can have the potential for harm. But if you're not thinking about that potential for harm, if you're not thinking about what harm you could do and only thinking about this like utopia is like version that you have in your head, then you're not going to be able to attend to those things because you're not looking for them and you only find out about them after people have already gotten harmed.
Yeah. Have you in your conversations, this isn't a pre vetted question, so indulge me if you can. Have you in your conversations with either users or producers found ways that people try to mitigate that lack of care, to take on that care for each other? You know, or have they talked about the specific kind of ways that that lack of care affects how they participate on platform?
So a little bit of both. I think sometimes people try to care and protect each other on some of these platforms. So for instance, um, you know, one thing that I saw quite a bit, um, when, they're kind of at the beginning of the kind of war in Gaza, where people were being censored or turned away. There was like people who were maybe more in a position of privilege. They lived in the US, maybe they had more money, they were white, whatever it was, they felt more safe, right? Doing this thing where they were trying to like fake out and then repost somebody else's video. In terms of asking people for donations, in terms of asking people for support, specifically for individual people who were experiencing harm. Um, Kind of people trying to take it upon themselves, especially if they feel like they are in a safer place or more of a place to do so, to connect other people to stories of people that they need to be helped or provide resources in some way. Um, I mean, I do think for some people, though, who do feel more vulnerable, it does create a sense of disconnection. They don't want to be in those spaces anymore. They don't want to have those conversations anymore. They don't want to be in these online spaces as much as they may enjoy parts of it, right? They assess that for their own safety. for their own mental health, it is just no longer worth it to be in that space. But I think I've seen both happen, right? And I think a lot of the times too, it's thinking about how vulnerable am I and what can I do and what can't I do?
Yeah. Um, I like that we're talking a little bit about vulnerability here because for me, I think about the ways that humans have, before the internet, for generations, tried to create spaces for vulnerability, which is very difficult, right? But is kind of key for any kind of political action, certainly, but also any kind of sense of real social cohesion. And I think it's something that has been eroding, especially in the United States, for like generations. Um, it leads me to this question, which is like, do you think about some of these kinds of cultural practices that ensure that communities feel secure and and can connect with each other in and through stories and platforms? I've been kind of writing about like the cookout as one sort of framework, right, as like an ancestral practice that at least theoretically allow people to kind of show up to spaces their full selves and enjoy each other, but also be able to like check each other and hold each other accountable, because there is a host that cares for that space. Do you think about like what are these kinds of frameworks, practices that maybe we can bring forward digitally to like allow for vulnerability?
I mean, one, and I don't know if there's a specific name for this practice per se, right? But I think for me, one thing that I always really enjoyed was like being able to like sit with other women in my family and learn about history and things they've been through and learn about their stories. And I think that there's sometimes a way that that gets translated in like these smaller group chat spaces and these like smaller intentional conversations that you use to connect digitally with people. I'm thinking about like even during the pandemic and being on like having like these different group chats of different girlfriends formed, and we were able to keep those same spaces that like we would have had, that I enjoyed having with women in my family, that I enjoyed having with my friends, that we weren't, literally we're not able to have because we were all in our homes. But like this intentionality of people kept setting them up because we were like, we want to be able to keep these spaces of connection. And I think there's something so important that we learn about ourselves and learn about others in those conversations, those very intentional, very small conversations where you kind of, if you learn about your experience moving through the world as Black women. You learn about your mother's experience, her mother's experience. And I think it informs the way you move forward as well. Um, Recently, it's maybe it's a little different, but I think it kind of almost inadvertently simulated this in some way. And I thought it was really beautiful. I recently did a series of focus groups with the Black women who live here in the town that I live in. And a lot of people, it spread through word of mouth. So there were a couple where some of the people who came in already knew each other and had these long relationships. And I wouldn't often know that until I showed up, like what their specific connections were to each other. But I had one, and a lot of the things we were talking about kind of politics generally in terms of political information. But it was one where it was a mother came with her best friend, but she also brought her two adult daughters. And the daughters were I think they were just very disheartened, I think, by kind of the state of the world, honestly. And they felt very, maybe a little demotivated, right? And I think partially understandably, they felt like, no one listens to what we have to say. what's the point? We keep saying things, they don't seem to care about us, right? And then their mom started their mom, on the other hand, was kind of very invested in kind of the potential power of voting and kind of maybe even big D democracy. And she started talking about, she grew up sharecropping and she had to fight for her right to get an education. And she wasn't born with the right to be able to vote and engage in our political system, right? She was born disenfranchised. And one of her daughters is like, these are the stories we need to hear because that changes my perspective on why this is so important. Because I've always grown up, I'm, probably in part like, taking some of these things for granted, and then she gets to hear about like why her mother can't take these things for granted, right? Because of what she had experienced and had endured, right? And like everything that she had built with her family and her daughters and this education and this career that she had built, like she had to fight for. No, people told her she couldn't have it and she said, yes, I can. And so I think like I was thinking about like those kinds of discussions I had with my mom and my nana, and like the ways we try to keep those in like closed spaces. I've heard like, I've surprisingly heard a lot of people talk about like how much they like things like not Facebook, but Facebook groups. Like, and one's like for Black women, or like these like smaller spaces that like you can lock who's in there, like the Signal chat that you have to get invited to, the Instagram chat that you have to get invited to, these very intentional spaces, and like being able to like share and be vulnerable in these spaces and learn about other people's experiences and think about like, hey, maybe this can also inform the way I move through the world.
Yeah, I think it really, so much of what you're saying is resonating in terms of, I mean, for me, when I write about the cookout, I write about the power of the invitation and of being invited in and knowing that not everyone is invited in. So there is a sense of like the person who invited me in knows that I can trust the other people in the room. And so I can be vulnerable. And there's kinds of conversations that I can't have if just anybody's invited, who might discount the value of my experience. So I was thinking about, you're like, there's not a word for this. I was thinking about like the kitchen table. Like we often talk about like
Mm-hmm.
conversations, which I think sometimes has a valence of like the mom and the dad and the two kids, like it has like this heteronormative imaginary, but actually can just be whoever you constitute as family. It could be close friends. I was
Mm-hmm.
even thinking about the circle in a lot of these conversations. Circles have come up. There's lots of different cultural traditions around people gathering in circles for all kinds of things. And there's this idea that we are facing each other. This is a closed group. Our backs are to the world so that we can focus in on each other.
Mm-hmm.
It's we're dancing, or it's like a susu circle, or it's a consciousness raising circle, or whatever, that those are really transformative spaces. And on social media, you're in a network, right? Like we imagine social media as like these webs of connections that like go out into infinity. And kind of like when you were talking about your social media origin story, like that's scary. Like and it's intimidating at the very least, even if it's not scary.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you be like, it doesn't make everyone feel like, oh, I can definitely raise my hand and tell my story in that context when I don't know where that story is going to go.
Yeah, you never know who's watching. But like as you said, like in a small group, in a cookout where you're invited, like you can like who's all gonna be there? Like
That's
who's all gonna be there? That's the first question you ask, right? Because that is the question that you know whether or not you're safe in that space. That's why people ask that question. That's why that question is so important.
yeah.
you know, like who's all gonna be here? Who's gonna see the things that I said? And I'm like, and do I trust these people to like hold this space for me? Uh, and you definitely don't get that everywhere. And you definitely don't get that everywhere, but you put your guard down a little when you feel like you can. Um, and yeah.
Yeah, Facebook groups, chat groups, these things have come out a lot in these conversations, though they have their own issues. Chat groups can, text message groups can like kind of go on endlessly, right? There's no time boundary. So some people have to silence their notifications, right? So they can like focus on their real lives. Or Facebook groups, like to find out what's in the group, you really get it on the news feed, which is algorithmically controlled. And we have an interview with Deepti Doshi at New Public, who, used to work for a Facebook group. And she was like, there were limits to that as Facebook got bigger and more algorithmic. People were less connected to their groups and more kind of thrown into the network, right, as it were. So all these things are challenging, but I do think that in this moment, people are thinking really intentionally about how they show up in digital space and really prioritizing safety more so than they have in the past. And I think that's ultimately a good thing for the culture.
No, I do too. I think awareness is important, right? Not, I think there, like, for a long time, we told ourselves, like, the utopian social media story, and then people realized that wasn't true. And now it's kind of this space of navigating, right? Like, I am aware of the risk and the danger. I'm also aware of like the importance for myself, for the information I consume, for connection to other people, and then people making like these very calculated decisions of like how I navigate through this kind of like complex maze and how I show up differently in these different online spaces, right? Like we used to think, like, I know we talk about like that, the thing about context collapse online and how you show up differently online and offline, but even in your online space, right, you can still show up differently in different parts of online spaces. And I think that's very, intentional. It's not, the reference that's coming to mind that is not correct at all is like Severance. I've been watching, but like you're not quite severed, right? But it's not quite just a one in the two of kind of most severed people. It's more like that one person who was like, I'm sorry if this is a spoiler, like she was severed 8 different ways, right? And that's becomes this like complex web of parts of who you are.
I'm not watching Severance. I know. Don't yell at me.
Okay. Well, also, if you do plan to watch it, I hope I didn't spoil it.
And will not remember that.
Okay, cool.
Sorry if you're watching and you haven't finished season 2. But yes, I mean, I think, in as much as I'm familiar with the literature on performance on social media, people will often cite like classic sociologist Irving Goffman and the stage backstage, and how we all kind of as a performer step onto a different stage based on the context of the environment and the person we're talking to. And that's just like how we've been as humans. It's just not possible to expect everyone to be the same in every space with every person. There are a couple of people like that, but I think those people end up having lots of problems, like in their lives, because you need to edit. It's just a thing that we need to do for identity formation. And
Yeah. And like I teach Goffman when I talk about online communities to my class, but like I'm like, I don't know if I tell, front stage, back stage, but also it's like side stage and like left wing stage, and like and then outside the theater, there's like all of these, I think it's that plus.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to end our conversation with 2 simple but potentially unfair questions. One is, what is one specific thing that you love about social media or tech that you think we should bring forth into the future? That can be a cultural practice, a design feature, a platform policy, a particular platform, what have you, and one thing that you would change or get rid of.
Change or get rid. Okay. So a thing I love is social media platforms moving towards like more and more multimodality. In terms of like, I want to be able to like make music and put stickers on a screen and write text and like put a video in there and then overlay a photo on top of the video. Like I love when people have all the options. Because I think, like, again, I love what people can come up with. And the more options you give people in ways to express themselves simultaneously, I think the more people can do with it, right? Like, I think the more you give people, the creativity knows no bounds. So, if we are to continue making more of these social media platforms in the future, I don't want to see like, this is for photos and this is for videos and like, this is for text. Like it all needs to be there. You need to have all the options, or I don't know if I can love it as much. And something that we can leave behind, or I'm probably a lot of things. Um, but yeah, I think the biggest thing is these kind of like punitive and like capitalist orientations towards platform governance policies. Like we will never know kind of the full breadth of what that connection could be when like these are the models that are shaping how people have to interact in these spaces.
Ashe, I completely agree. Yeah. And yes to the multimodality. I think it's been a challenge for some smaller platforms because video especially is very expensive to host. And so like I think Blue Sky is now just getting their kind of video platform, but I think it's like a separate thing, even Blue Screen, but like you can't, I think, just upload long videos to Blue Sky because they don't have the resources to support it. But we live multimodal lives, right? In our everyday lives. And so if you're going to try and replicate digital space, physical space and digital space, you kind of have to give people the full breadth of experience. That's how joy and innovation emerges. So here's hoping that some anti-corporate, anti-capitalist platforms can develop robust alternatives that are also care-centered in their analytics and ways of being, so that we can maybe improve upon our connections in digital space. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to speak with me, Chelsea. It's been good to see you.
Yes, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for having me.